was thinking about this meeting and our favorite quote that we always use about Thomas Paine, saying that those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men and women, undergo the fatigue of supporting it. Then our other great quote is, "There's no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love." And the German philosopher Goethe said, "Truth must be repeated again and again, because error is constantly being preached roundabout." And that is a constant reason for us to know what to do. Think about it. It's good to remember we are citizens of the land the Lord calls choice above all others. Here is where pilgrims and those seeking religious freedom came and then fought and gave their all. Just remember, after George Washington led the ragtag Continental Army to success over the British, Europe then looked at America as a viable nation and country. The mighty British Army had been humbled by the ragtag Continental Army. Remember patriots like Thomas Paine with his pamphlet on common sense, which inspired the Army and America's people. So we have a Constitution that we're wanting to uphold. And so this presentation today by Professor Woodruff is timely with what's going on in the legislature. So at this point, there's a couple of announcements I need to make time for. Pam Allen has one, and then Sharon.
First of all, please sign in if you haven't already. I'll start it here and then send it around there. And if you're brand new, there's a place for you to sign up so you can be sure to get the emails. But what I want to tell right now is I'm starting a new chapter of Moms for America in the Provo-Orem area. And I'm hoping that people will realize it's not just for moms, it's for anyone who understands the problems that we're facing right now and wants to educate themselves as well as their children so we can raise patriots and have be able to keep the liberties that we enjoy in America and bring back the ones that we've lost. So if you are interested in this, you can email or text me and I will send you information that you can take a look at and see what I saw and said, I've got to be able to do this, and hopefully you'll be able to join with me. You know other people that would like to have them, please take as many as you can. I've got 50 of these today, so don't be sparing. Thank you.
Okay, on the table up here, we have some congressional scorecards for Mike Lee, and they are based on or published by the New American Freedom Index. The website is on the board here. You can access the Freedom Index. It's published every 6 months, and they take 10 issues in Congress, like the House has 10 bills or resolutions, and they rate the representatives on their constitutional votes. And they do the same for the Senate. And interestingly, Mike Lee, the last Freedom Index, had 100% on constitutional votes. If you go to the website, you can look up any representative or senator and see what their lifetime score is, what their current score is. But these scorecards condense that into 6 issues. And you'll notice, Mike Lee, again, 100%. So feel free to take some of these scorecards to spread the word to your neighbors. There are also some flyers on the Prop 2 for Orem. It's to establish a separate school district for Orem. And we know the smaller the unit of government and the closer it is to the people, the more responsive it is to us. So that's a very important thing. Also check the back table. There's some free issues of the New American that you can take, a pocket constitution, some free calendars. There will be some brochures on the Article 5 Convention, which you can find more at jbs.org. The website is over there. Click on action items, and then you click on the CONCON issue. There are pages with all kinds of resources that will go right along with what we're learning today. Thanks.
Now it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor William Woodruff. And Gayle, would you like to speak about his background a bit?
Well, I wasn't really prepared to do this, but I will tell you, this man has become a blessing in my life. I've told him that, because I had an experience that I needed to just read and study all I could on whether or not we should be having a second constitutional convention, an Article 5 convention, a convention of the states. I mean all those things because not all of them are the correct way to describe it. But at the same time I was going through this, some friends and friends of his told me about this amazing paper that he had written. At that point, it was, I think it's more pages now, but it was like 50 pages in. The reason there's more pages is because the way it was published was a little differently than the original. It was what I was looking for, because what he had done, he is a law professor. He has got a constitutional background. My friends that know him and worked with him for years, Elaine Donnelly being one of them, can't say enough about what he is knowing, what he knows, his understanding of the Constitution, and I found that in a hurry. I read those 50 pages and just wanted to cry because it was the answer to my prayers. And for me, the big thing about having these papers and his knowledge and his understanding was that the people supporting and pushing for an Article 5 convention have their law professor guru, Professor Nadelson, that they quote him, call upon him, they publish him, they use him, they have for years. No matter what you say, they say, but Professor Nadelson, and he's the expert, and this is what he said. Well, guess what this paper was? This paper was actually refuting or explaining, or whatever you want to say, the things that Professor Nadelson said, and I liked. It was just amazing. I actually told Wood that when we were in St. Louis together, I said, I don't know how you feel about God and these things, but you were an answer to prayer. God sent you at that very moment in time. I needed that information for a very, very important reason. I had just got 2 or 3 weeks to prepare for something that turned out to be one of the most important things I've done in my life, and I couldn't have done it without this good man. So we are so fortunate. He moved to Utah. He'll tell you about that himself. And so here he is. He's in Utah. He was speaking. There was a panel. I was on the panel. He was on the panel at Eagle Council. All of that happened right in that very same 3 weeks when I needed him.
Please welcome.
Thank you, Gayle, for those kind words. There are God moments that happen all through our lives, and it's interesting. You know, if you look at the first 30 chapters of Genesis, you see the movement of the early patriarchs through the desert, and everywhere they go, where they encounter. They have a direct personal encounter with the Lord. They build an altar and they stack up stones, right? They build an altar. And it's years later, generations later, they'll come back and to that altar, their descendants will come back to that altar, and they'll remember how God impacted their lives at that particular point. And I think the moral of that story for us is we need to build altars as we go through life and have those encounters with the Lord, these God moments that do that. We need to build those altars in our lives so we can go back and reflect on them and see how the Lord has been leading. Otherwise, it's coincidence, right? It just happens. So anyway, I came to this Article 5 issue. Can you hear me okay, or do I need to stand up? Okay. I came to this Article 5 issue rather strangely, I guess. Dear friend of mine, colleague, and client that I've worked with for years and years and years asked me to take a look at some material that was published by the Convention of the States Project and explain something to her. And so I took a look at it and read the materials and read them again. I said, these guys are pretty confident about their position. They told us that it's a convention of the states. They told us what the rules are. They even have a pretty solid prediction of what the outcome will be. They've got all the questions answered. That's interesting. And so then I started to look at the supporting materials, what they claimed supported these very confident positions that they had. And as a lawyer and a law professor, how you cite legal materials to support your position is critically important. That's what makes your reputation as a lawyer. If you're telling the court that the sky is blue, but you don't have a Supreme Court decision that says that, it's just your opinion, right? You need the Supreme Court to say the sky is blue. Well, as I dug into the Convention of the States materials and materials published by other people in this area, it occurred to me that the support for the conclusions were extremely weak. And most of the arguments all began with an attempt or an effort to refute the argument that an Article 5 convention was a constitutional convention that would throw out the Constitution and produce a whole new form of government, like what happened in Philadelphia in 1787. And as I got to looking at those arguments and the supporting materials, I came to the conclusion that argument is basically a straw man argument. That when the proponents of an Article 5 convention start out by saying, well, Article 5 convention is not going to be a runaway convention. The Philadelphia Convention was not a runaway convention. Throwing out the Constitution cannot happen. They've shifted the argument. And I think fundamentally it is a mistake for opponents of an Article 5 convention to engage in that argument. Because you're never going to answer it. It's like standing there, is to, is not, is to, is not. Somebody's going to have to make that decision. It's like 2-year-olds in the sandbox. And so it never resolves, you can never answer that question fundamentally, but it distracts everyone from all the other stuff. And once the proponents engage the opponents in this argument over whether it's a runaway convention, whether the Philadelphia Convention is a runaway convention, once they engage in that, then they step back and say, oh, by the way, it's a convention of the states. Here are the rules. These things are not unusual. We've had them for years and years and years throughout our history. We've had all of these things. Everybody knows how these things work. Not to worry. And it sounds so reasonable and so reassuring that folks sort of go along and don't look behind it from there. Well, I got to look behind it. And I haven't studied this all my life. This has not been my passion for decades. And that's kind of scary when somebody who comes at this relatively recently, just out of curiosity, can spot so many weaknesses in these arguments that have been made for a long time. So that tells me that nobody's really looking critically at these, so we're not engaging in the right issues. So that's what I've tried to do in my paper. This URL here is a place where if you want to download the paper, it's a free download from the Social Science Research Network. You go on there and there's a little button that says download, you can download it. And just about everything that I'm gonna talk about today is explained in considerably more detail there. But that paper is available. Yes, sir.
Since that says forthcoming, is that actually the final version, or might there be some editing?
It is in the process of being edited now, but we're talking about citation formats and these sort of things. Substantively, it's, you know, I'm not changing my view on this. I mean, that it is what it is. So it'll give you the substantive arguments. So what I would like to do with you this morning, if you don't mind, is take you through some of the arguments, what appears to me to be the main arguments that's put forth by the Convention of the States people, and then respond to those. And there's even just this past week, there was some new stuff that came up. I'll address those too. It's not specifically in the PowerPoint. But if we start at the beginning, back in Philadelphia in 1787, the founders saw a need as they were putting together the constitutions. They were drafting the Constitution. They saw a need to build into the Constitution an amendment process, a process that was doable, but not so onerous that it could never be done, because all of these men recognized that the Constitution that they drafted was not perfect. And it wasn't. And they knew that it would be, as experience would dictate over the coming years and decades, that there would be a need to amend things. In fact, the whole thing nearly got scuttled because we didn't have a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. Of course, that came later. But they saw that need to do it. And Article 5 of the Constitution is where they captured that. And as you well know, it provides two ways to amend the Constitution. One is through a proposal by Congress, 2/3 of the House and Senate vote to propose an amendment, and then it goes to the states for ratification by whichever method Congress determines is appropriate, either by the state legislature or by state conventions. The alternative, of course, is a convention for proposing amendments. 3/4 of the states have to apply for such a convention. When we hit the magic number, Congress then calls the convention, the states send their delegates, the convention convenes, does its work. When they're finished, whatever proposals they've agreed upon go out to the states for ratification by the method that Congress so determines, whether it be the legislatures or the state conventions. Now, we've amended the Constitution 27 times. Every single time it's been the congressional method. We've never had a convention for proposing amendments. The numbers over the years, we've come close. It's probably the closest was the pressure to change the election of senators from the legislature to direct election of senators. We got really close to getting the magic number of that one. Congress then saw the handwriting on the wall, proposed the amendment, of course, it's ratified. We have a popular election of senators. But we've never had a convention for proposing amendments. Let me give you just a little bit of a snapshot, if I might, as to what transpired in Philadelphia in 1787. The year before, in the 13 colonies were sitting around it, and there were problems, okay? They weren't getting along. They had some serious interstate commerce issues, how to manage tariffs and navigable waterways and those sorts of things that they needed to sort out. And so there was a proposal to have a convention in Annapolis, Maryland, where the states would come together and they would hammer out these difficulties and try to sort out, we were operating under the Articles of Confederation in those days. And the Articles of Confederation were pretty good with regard to national defense and getting us through the Revolutionary War. But for running a country, they were not good at all. They just didn't have enough, they didn't cover enough of the issues that needed to be addressed by a fledgling nation like the United States. So, a convention was called in Annapolis, and out of the 13 colonies, it seems like, 5 showed up?
5.
So, not everybody decided to come. And so there wasn't enough to do anything substantively. James Madison, who was a member of the Virginia legislature at the time, was one that proposed this Annapolis Convention. And so the only real piece of business that the convention in Annapolis did was say, you know what, we really need to have a convention and talk about this whole issue, not just these narrow interstate commerce issues, but the broader topic of how you govern a nation. And so the 5 states at the Annapolis Convention recommended that we meet in Philadelphia in 1787, and let's hash all of this out. Well, that happens. Every state except Rhode Island sent delegates to Philadelphia. Congress got into the act sort of late after a number of states had already published resolutions. Congress added to theirs, said, yeah, well, we think you ought to go to Philadelphia and do this too, and we recommend that the scope of the convention be limited to amending the Articles of Confederation. 3 other states out of the 13, or actually 12, because Rhode Island didn't play. 3 of the other states, New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, all said, yeah, our delegates will go with the idea to amend the Articles of Confederation.
Delaware also.
Yeah, Delaware. It's not New Hampshire, it's Delaware. So you had 3 states, and those 3 states limited their delegates to amending the Articles of Confederation. Okay? The rest of the state resolutions were say, hey, boys, go and let's come up with something that will govern the country. Okay? So they were rather broad scope. And so they all went, and as you know now, the rest is history. But while we were in the convention, this issue of amendments came up. Initially it was suggested that the legislature, the Congress, the House, and the Senate be the place where amendments of the Constitution would be proposed. George Mason and some others said, well, we think if the federal government gets corrupt, they're not going to want to pass amendments that are going to favor the state. So maybe we ought to have a state's method of proposing amendments as well. And so this idea of a convention for proposing amendments was offered. And there was debate in the convention over this. So you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that were dealing with this particular issue. It was interesting, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, and you'll see where this piece drops in a moment. When the convention method was first proposed in the convention in 1787, James Madison said, wait a minute, boys, what is this convention for proposing amendments? How will it operate? What will be the effect of its work? Who's going to run this thing? So he objected to it. He wasn't keen on it. he made an amendment later on that was adopted by the you know, skullduggery in legislative chambers happens, but he made an amendment later on that changed that convention process to one where the state legislatures, where instead of 3/4 of the states applying for a convention, 3/4 of the states would propose amendments. You would have a convention and be coming from the state legislatures, just like the congressional ones would come from Congress. And that was approved. So, right? So it goes back into the committee of style, and they're rearranging things and drafting to make sure all the language lines up and that sort of stuff. And as it comes back out later, it's changed, excuse me, to this convention for proposing amendments. Madison said, well, but he's voted down, so we have Article 5 that says what Article 5 says. Okay? So there we are. Of course, it's ratified, and the fact that this provision was in the convention, was in the Constitution, seems to me was a positive thing insofar as ratifying the Constitution was concerned. Because you had Federalist and Anti-Federalist factions. You had those that really feared a strong national government. And the fact that there was a way to propose amendments to the Constitution without being dependent upon Congress was a positive factor for the Anti-Federalists. So it helped in the ratification arguments down the road. So here we are, some 230 some odd years later, wondering whether we're going to have an Article 5 convention. But before that, slightly more than a year after the Philadelphia Convention finished its work, there was the move to add the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And George Tuberville, a fellow Virginian, wrote James Madison a letter. And George said, Jimmy, what do you think about a convention to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution? Everybody kind of agrees that we need this. New York seems to be big on this. What do you think? After all, James Madison was the father of the Constitution, right? I mean, if anybody ought to value somebody's opinion, it ought to be James Madison, right? So he gets this letter from George Tuberville in November of 1788, and he replies a few days later. And this is one of the things that he said. Now, this is coming from a guy who knows about conventions, right? He was a member of that Annapolis Convention of the States, because that's what that was. He was a member of the Virginia legislature. He was a delegate to the Virginia Constitutional Convention. He was a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention. James Madison knew conventions. And James Madison says, I don't think so. We had everything going for us in Philadelphia, and we got out with the skin of our teeth, basically. I hate to think that we would go back and try this whole process again now, even though we may have amendments that everybody agrees with. The fact that we're going to put it in front of a convention is going to create problems. And he suggested, or he didn't suggest, he told Tuberville that the congressional process was far better, was a better way to proceed than with a constitutional, with an Article 5 convention. Madison's main objections, there were 4 in his letter to George Tuberville, but 3 of them are really important for us today. The 4th one, I'll just mention it quickly, and we'll look at the other 3 in a little bit more detail. Remember, this was just over a year after the Philadelphia Convention when this letter was written. And Madison was concerned that if we convene another convention just a little over a year after the original one, that's going to send the message to the rest of the world that we don't know what we're doing. we're on shaky grounds, and they shake confidence in us as a nation in the eyes of the rest of the world. So I think for that reason it's a bad idea. I don't think that's to the same degree. I mean, there may be other reasons why the other countries of the world think that we're on shaky grounds, okay? But it's not because we just had a constitutional convention. So I don't think that particular objection by Madison is germane to the current debate. The first one, Madison said, look, the congressional method is simpler. It's much easier, much more straightforward. Amendments can be offered by any member of the House or Senate. They can be debated, beat around, revised, as long as they secure 2/3 of the vote of each house. They go to the states for ratification. You don't have to have another convention. You don't have to sort through all of these procedural issues that the Constitution is completely silent over and doesn't address. And, it's not as messy. So it's much simpler. State representatives can coordinate with each other. We can get a consortium of states agreeing. There's all kind of reasons that Madison believed that the congressional method was far superior to the convention method. That was his first one. His second objection was that and the third, it would do more harm than good. So the congressional method is simpler in the sense that it's easier to process. But the downside is that Congress may not pass or propose amendments that tend to dilute their influence and their authority. And that's, I think, a legitimate concern. I would suggest, however, that remember, the folks that are sitting in the House of Representatives and in the chamber of the United States Senate were sent there by us. If we cannot send people to those jobs and in those positions who will represent our interests, what makes you think you will be able to select delegates to a convention for proposing amendments that will do any better? You see, here's the amendment process right here. We have that ability. One of the other arguments that gets kicked around here is, look, the problem is not with the Constitution. The Constitution is fine. The problem is we haven't followed it. And so if we amend it and don't follow the amendments, what good is it? See, term limits. You know who can establish term limits? Right here in this room. You vote the bums out, right? Okay, it's really easy for me to stand up here and throw rocks like that. We all know that the political process is a little bit more complicated than that. But it's really, it may be complicated, but it's simple. Okay? And we need to, in my opinion, need to look at the simple fixes before we start getting into the more detailed and complicated fixes. Okay? But anyway, back to what James Madison thought, not what I thought. The congressional method was simpler. His second one is that a convention itself would create divisiveness. And he said in this letter to Turnerville, and let me pull some quotes out of here. The letter, I've quoted a lot of the letter in the article, so you've got some stuff there. He was he was predicting that partisans would take over the process, that we would not have this unanimity towards an ultimate goal or an ultimate purpose, that political partisanship, that the heterogeneity of the delegates in political philosophies and personalities and character traits would dominate the debate at the convention. And regardless of the merits of any particular proposal or amendment, the process itself would create further divisiveness. Now, this is from a guy who's spent his adult life in conventions. I think he probably knows the dynamics of a convention far better than modern legal academics who can tell us that everything's going to be hunky-dory. I would prefer Madison's experience-based opinions rather than the theoretical views of modern legal academics.
Well, and Madison with Jefferson were the two that started the, quote, anti-federalist party. Yeah. So he was already dividing the country in partisanism.
Yeah, the country was already, and in his letter to D'Urville, he's not predicting that this divisiveness will occur. It's already there, and it's going to be exacerbated by this sort of convention process. What was his concern in 1788 when he corresponded with George Stroman? As a result, you would have a distrust that would develop of the opposing sides. You wouldn't be drawn together in unity. There would be distrust that would result for it. The infighting over the wisdom of holding a convention, number one, and the substance of amendments would just exacerbate these already extant divisions. And I suggest to you that maybe we're more divided as a nation today than we were then. Though the divisions were stark in those days, everybody still had there was an ultimate goal, be out from under the yoke of England, and, be on our own. I'm not sure we've got a simple singular goal like that today. So that was his second objection about a convention would create divisiveness. And thirdly, and I've labeled this objection one that was the convention itself would be controlled by the delegates, not by the state legislatures, not by Congress, but by the men. In his day, it would have been all men, not so today, but by the people who show up with credentials from their state saying they're delegates to the convention. They're the ones who are going to run the show in Madison. And how did Madison know that? He'd been going to these conventions all his adult life. Experience. You don't take my word for it. Go, look at what he did. I've never been a delegate to a convention like that, so I'm not talking from personal experience. I'm suggesting Madison did have personal experience. The delegates, and these are quotes from his letter, he said there would be violent partisans on both sides. The most heterogeneous characters, opposites. Opposites don't attract this. And individuals of insidious views. Do you know how to define an insidious view? It's one in which I don't agree with, right? Isn't that where we are?
Yes.
Okay, so we at least, I think he was probably a little bit more nuanced than that. I think he had more experience on that. Yes, sir.
One of the biggest concerns I have about Concons is how the delegates are actually picked. I don't think there are any rules that says how a state will pick their delegates.
There are not. The Constitution is.
Please, no more comments, we're recording this, so we'll wait for the comments after. Please.
So no questions later then?
Let's do questions later.
Okay,
Okay,
great.
And I'll try to move along quickly here so we get to those kind of things. So you've got, these are the folks that are gonna be at the convention. Now, a number of years ago, the Convention of the States Project hosted a mock Article 5 convention in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it turned out terrific. It was harmonious, everybody was agreeable. They passed some amendments that everybody, they patted themselves on the back. It was wonderful. That's how it's supposed to operate, they said. Well, in the press releases, it was hard to get into some of the details, but in the press releases, I found that they had delegates from almost every state. And somewhere in there, it said, and a few of them were Democrats. Democrats. In other words, it was, with the exception of a handful of people, it was a homogeneous group of like-minded, similar or same political philosophy, attending a convention and saying this is the way we would like the world to be. Piece of cake. Totally divorced from reality, because the Constitution doesn't say how delegates are going to be selected. The Constitution is silent on that. So how will delegates be selected? How do state legislatures select boards, commissions, or other appointed type offices in our culture today? What's the magic word? Appointed. They're appointed, yeah, but money could be a thing.
Their party.
The party, and a lot of them are split legislators. You know, you've got a mixture. Diversity. We have to have diversity, right, in everything. If you don't have diversity, you're bigoted, you're prejudiced, you're discriminating. You've got to have diversity. You've got to have equity and inclusion. So I suggest to you that however delegates get selected, they're not going to be the kind of delegation that you saw at the mock convention in Williamsburg a number of years ago. They will be reflective of the population of the state, or at least of the political demographics in the state. And that gets back to what Madison was concerned about with the dynamics of a convention and how it operated. Then we come to the deliberations, the rules of how the convention may operate. And Madison thought that the convention would provide a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric of the Constitution, is what he was talking about. Could not be conducted in harmony and would not terminate in the general good. Those were his essential objections, and of course, we did not convene a convention for the Bill of Rights. It was passed by Congress, 2/3, go to the states, ratified by the states. So Madison's warning was heeded back when the Bill of Rights was being considered. His objections were carried the day, if you will. So let's look quickly at what the proponents of an Article 5 convention predict. This is the way they say things will turn out. First of all, the first thing is they start with the proposition that an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments is a convention of the states. Once you establish that, the rest of their arguments sort of fall in line and have some logical support, because a convention of the states is a real thing. We really had those. The Annapolis Convention was an example, and there have been many others in the course of history. But notice what the language of Article 5 says. Article 5 doesn't say that when 3/4 of the state legislature submit an application, Congress will call a convention of the states.
2/3.
2/3. 34 states is 2/3, yes. All right, thank you. 34 states call for a convention. Congress doesn't call a convention of the states. It calls a convention for proposing amendments. A constitutional entity that is created in Article 5 of the Constitution, not Article 1 dealing with the legislature, not Article 2 dealing with the executive, not Article 3 dealing with the judiciary, the three branches of government, but a separate federal constitutional entity created by the Constitution and vested with authority to propose amendments. And it's going to be engaged in a federal constitutional function. But for Article 5, we wouldn't be talking about it. It's a constitutional concept and creation, not something that was just picked off the shelf of the library. Interesting that when the Article 5 Convention for Proposing Amendments was first introduced in the Philadelphia Convention, James Madison raised questions about how it's going to operate, what's it's going to do, what's going to be the force and effect of its decisions, those sorts of things. If it were a convention of the states, you wouldn't have those questions. Because those were pretty clear. And that's why I think the proponents of an Article 5 convention want everyone to buy into this notion that it's a convention of the states, because it brings a lot of those unknowns into the known categories. Professor Nadelson, whom you're probably all familiar with, has addressed this argument. And he said, look, somebody points out that there's nothing in the records of the Constitutional Convention to say that James Madison's concerns were ever addressed or resolved. And Nadelson said, not to worry. They didn't need to. Everyone knew that an Article 5 convention, I'm almost quoting verbatim, everyone knew that an Article 5 convention was a convention of the states. Well, I suggest to you James Madison didn't know. The father of the Constitution didn't think it was a convention of the states because he asked questions. The very questions that would not have been appropriate if it were a convention of the states. You see, I think this is a unique creation, this Article 5 convention. It's not one that was just plucked off the library shelf. If so, all Congress had to do, or all the convention had to do, was say in Article 5 that when 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a convention, Congress shall call a convention of the states. So, easy. They did not do that. They created a new entity for a new purpose. It had never been done before. It has never been done to this day. So, I suggest to you that the first line of argument in this is to push back against this notion that it's a convention of the states. Now, let me just add a little footnote. This, and all of this is my personal opinion based upon my study of research and that sort of thing. I don't think an Article 5 convention is a constitutional convention. And I think perhaps over the years, and I understand why, because boy, that sounds really cool. We all can get behind that and that sort of thing. But I think those sorts of labels, like Convention of the States and CONCON, blurs the issues. It gets us off of focusing what's really at stake and what's really important. Because Article 5 talks about the process, whether it's congressional or convention for proposing amendments, is a process to propose amendments to this Constitution. So I don't think that anyone in Philadelphia envisioned that a convention for proposing amendments could do what the Philadelphia Convention did to the Articles of Confederation. That's my opinion. Other people have different opinions. But the point is, there are other very good reasons and arguments to refute the notion that this is a convention of the states, and with all of the ancillary trappings that go along with that. Okay? Now, if you buy, however, that an Article 5 convention is a convention of the states, the next argument they make is the convention of the states can be limited in scope and topic. And I suggest to you that a convention of the states could be limited in scope and topic. The Annapolis Convention was. They were there to deal with certain interstate commerce type issues. That was what they got, that was their problem. They got that. That wasn't what was going on in Philadelphia. But if it's not a convention of the states, if it's a convention for proposing amendments, and from a structural standpoint, remember, we've got a congressional process and a convention process that are, at least in theory, they're offsetting. There's a symmetry between them, right? Congress could do it their way, or if they're not going to do it, then we've got this convention process where we, the people, can get involved and propose amendments. So there's a symmetry. And so the convention process under Article 5 acts much like Congress is. Notice that when Congress proposes amendments, they don't go to the state legislature for legislature approval unless Congress says that's the method of ratification. And Congress gets to decide that. Similarly, from an Article 5 convention, if a convention proposes amendment, it wouldn't go to Congress for their approval. They're out of the picture. All they've done is specify the mode of ratification. They've got no up or down vote on this thing at this point. The same with the state legislatures. They don't go back to the state legislatures for their approval before the formal ratification process begins. So the convention in that setting is just like Congress in the congressional method. Once they've done it, it goes forward. Now, of course, in Congress it takes 2/3 to propose the amendment. How many does it take to propose an amendment out of a convention?
50+1.
Does it? Where does it say 2/3? It doesn't.
Majority, 50%+1.
Does it say, you know how we'll find out?
Over.
If a convention is ever convened, we'll find out when the convention decides how they're going to do it. Because it's not specified. Now, the convention of states, people say, well, it's a convention of states, one state, one vote. Well, that's nice and fine if you assume it's a convention of states. But I suggest to you that it's not. And if it were a convention of states, James Madison would not have raised the issues that he raised. So I suggest to you that the same reason that the state legislature of Utah cannot dictate what our senators and our representatives do in Congress, it's the same reason that the state of Utah, the legislature, can't dictate what delegates to a convention for proposing amendments would do. It's a federal entity doing a federal purpose. It's not going to be able to be micromanaged. This is my opinion, you understand? I'm just one lawyer. It's not going to be able to be micromanaged by the state legislature. And think about it for a moment. How would the state legislature effectively micromanage the conduct of a convention for proposing amendments?
Is that a question?
Yeah, that's a question. It'll be recorded, so go ahead.
Look at New York, Delaware, and Massachusetts. They were supposed to have been limited in their scope at the first.
You read my paper, didn't you?
I did. No, I did not. But
You raise a good point. Here's what, the interesting thing about the Philadelphia Convention, this runaway thing, 3 states had specific limitations on delegates, only amend the Articles of Confederation, right? Those 3 states sent a total of 10 delegates. Of those 10 delegates who went to Philadelphia operating under specific restrictions by their state legislature to only amend the Articles of Confederation, 70%, 7 out of the 10, ignored those limitations. 3 of them said, okay, you guys are going to do something really different here, not just amend the Articles of Confederation, we're going home. That's why Alexander Hamilton was by himself. He was the only New York delegate. And he was under the same operating restrictions that his colleagues Lansing and Yates were. But, I mean, he was up to his earlobes in drafting the Constitution. So the point is, if 70% are going to ignore those things in Philadelphia, what kind of confidence does that give us it'll happen now? Okay? Let me come back to it. The other piece is, and got a little bit of this later on, some states have passed what's called delegate controls resolutions to make it a felony if the delegate doesn't vote for appropriate amendments or votes for inappropriate amendments. There's a fundamental principle in our criminal law that says before we can convict somebody of a crime, there's got to be fair notice of what conduct is criminalized. We're talking about a convention that's a deliberative body. With the horse trading and the deal making and the compromise, how in the world can you ever give notice sufficient to support a criminal conviction to delegates and send them off to a convention that nobody knows the outcome? They don't even know the rules that are going to be applied by the convention. And look, well, in the Electoral College, we've got this faithless elector rule, right? That if you're elected to the Electoral College, you've got to cast your vote in the Electoral College consistent with the majority vote in your state. The Electoral College is not a deliberative body, people. It's the Electoral College. Everybody knows going in. That's their role. Because because the convention is a deliberative body, you can't go into it with a preconceived amendment that votes up or down. Otherwise, you don't have a convention because there's no deliberation involved there. So, trying to control the scope and the topic is in my opinion, a fool's errand. Let me give you just a quick example of the sort of thing that happens. You're all familiar with legislatures and how they do it, and bills get amended and that sort of thing. The House of Representatives passed H.R. 3590, and it was a bill that provided first-time tax credits. It provided tax credits to certain first-time military home buyers. Give them some tax breaks. They passed the House of Representatives. It goes to the Senate. Harry Reid, then the majority leader, takes H.R. 3590, leaves the bill number H.R. 3590, strips out everything that follows it, and replaces it with the text and language of what we now know as the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. The Senate passes it. It goes back to the House and is passed in the House, and ergo we have Obamacare. Wait a minute, you say, hold on. Obamacare, health insurance, controlling a sixth of the economy versus a bill for those aren't the same topic. That's not the same subject matter. Don't use that as an analogy of things that can happen at an Article 5 convention. Well, fast forward a few years. Litigation over the constitutionality of Obamacare. The individual mandate specifically. It was held constitutional. Why? It's a tax. because it was a tax. Thank you, Chief Justice Roberts. So, in other words, we've got a tax bill in the House, 3590, and we've got a tax bill in the Senate. Same topic. You control the scope of the legislative action. And I suggested the same sorts of things can occur at a convention. And who's to say? What's the enforcement mechanism? Even if there were a way that arguably you could control the scope of the topic, how do you do that? Well, I mentioned earlier, well, you control the delegates. Well, in the freewheeling range of a convention, going back and forth with debates and compromises and horse trading, you're going to control the delegates. You know, the Philadelphia Convention was conducted in secret. I don't know if an Article 5 convention would be conducted in secret or not. I don't know if we'd know. In our modern world, leaks would happen, I guess, and we might know, but maybe not officially. But the whole notion that it can be limited as a practical matter, much less a legal matter, or delegates can be controlled, is a pretty weak argument based upon what we see around us, the reality of the political process, stretching back to Philadelphia in 1787 to where we are today. And then they said, well, not to worry, Woody, you're just getting all worked up. All of this stuff is subject to judicial review. Professor Nadelson wrote a book. It's more like a legal treatise. It's called The Law of Article 5. Oh, well, okay. The guy has written a lot on Article 5. He's probably written and published more on Article 5 than everybody else put together. So maybe he knows what he's talking about. I bought the book. Well, I bought the Kindle edition. The hard copy was too expensive. I bought the Kindle edition and I read it. And he says, and I quote, that Article 5 issues are, quote, freely justiciable. Now that's lawyer talk for federal courts will answer the question. Federal courts will hear the case and they'll answer the question. In the subtext, he didn't say this, but the inference is, and they'll answer the question in your favor. Well, nothing could be further than the truth. When we talk about justiciability in federal courts, we're talking about a whole bucket of issues. Whether the plaintiff has standing, whether the case is ripe for judicial review, whether events have transpired that make it moot, no longer a live controversy, that there's a rule against no advisory opinions. You can't just ask a federal court to tell us what you think the law is. That's beyond the jurisdiction of our Article 3 judiciary. And there's the political question doctrine. The Constitution commits to one of the coordinate branches of government that decision, and federal courts stay out of it. Those issues are present in every single lawsuit that is filed in every federal court around the land, without exception. And in the Article 5 issues, there have been a number of cases where those kinds of issues have precluded the court's involvement. Now, the courts have handled some of the cases and ruled on the merits in some cases, primarily in issues about, the most recent are whether the Equal Rights Amendment was properly ratified or not, and the time limitations and that sort of thing. Courts have ruled on those. But to say that these issues are freely justiciable, if one of my law students had done that sort of citation, they would not have received, shall we say, an exemplary grade. That is not good lawyering. There are too many nuances there. So to say that these issues, and in my paper I go into a bit more detail on this judicial review issue. And then there's the other piece here. Again, the Convention of the States folks in some of their materials have said that the federal courts are part of the problem. They need to be reformed. Remove this life tenure business and that sort of thing. Well, if that is true, if they believe that, why would they express confidence that these same federal courts would hear their plea about the convention process and answer it in their favor. Theologic astounds me. But apparently logic is not going in the realm in this debate. So I suggest to you that judicial review is illusory at best. And we will not know if a court will review some of these critical issues that we've talked about until a convention is convened, until it does its work, until a proposed amendment comes out the door and somebody files a lawsuit. And then you got a problem with who you're going to sue. Because once the convention produces its work product, it's done. It's not a permanent entity. You're going to sue the convention, it evaporates. These are one-off things. So the justiciability, the judicial review issues are serious. The case that leads Professor Nadelson's citation of authority for his proposition that these issues are fully justiciable is a case out of North Carolina called the Opinion of the Justices, and it's an advisory opinion from the North Carolina Supreme Court on which method the North Carolina legislature ought to use in ratifying an earlier amendment that was proposed by Congress.
How old is that?
That case, I'll have to look it up for you. And I can give you the citation later. I've got it in there. I don't remember it off the top of my head. If I tell you, it'll be wrong. So I'll look it up for you. And in there, the Supreme Court of North Carolina makes the statement that, well, whether a constitutional amendment will be ratified or not is going to be up to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's no analysis. There's no briefing. That wasn't the issue. It was an advisory opinion by a state Supreme Court. Hardly authority for the principle that federal courts have jurisdiction to review any and all Article 5 controversies. For a law professor, or any lawyer, to cite that case for that proposition, I think they need to go back to Legal Writing 101 and do a refresher course. It is astounding that that footnote is in his book. And it's those sort of things that got me interested in this. When I started reading that sort of stuff, I said, wait a minute. These arguments are specious. There's the support for them is just not there. And then finally, the claim is that any proposed amendments are subject to 3/4 of the state's ratification, either by convention or legislature, depending on what Congress says, right? So I call this the ratification safeguard. Now, I suggest to you that if you stop and think a minute, if we get to the ratification safeguard, what does that mean about all of their other arguments? It means it failed. Because all those other arguments are saying, oh, don't worry, nothing bad can happen. There's not going to be any rogue amendments. It can't happen. Well, if you've got to rely on the ratification safeguard, it did happen. So it belies all of their other arguments. Now, in the legal world, in litigation, we do what's called alternative pleading. Your Honor, my guy didn't do it. But if he did do it, he was crazy. Okay? We can make those alternative legal pleadings in litigation, but they're not very persuasive. I wouldn't stand before the jury and say, members of the jury, my guy wasn't even there that day. But if he was, he certainly didn't do it. They're going to say, wait a minute, what do you think, I'm a fool? So they're not very persuasive when you get down to decision makers. I mean, it's a legal thing that we do to cover bases and that sort of stuff. But if that's the best you got, you're really in trouble. The other problem with this ratification safeguard is from the time that a state submits an application for a convention for proposing amendments. And when 33 other states get their applications in, and Congress calls a convention, and states send delegates, and the convention convenes, and the convention does its work, and the amendments are proposed, how much time?
Decades.
How many election cycles have passed? What has changed? I am so old that I can remember when profligate government spending caused inflation. But now I know that government spending cures inflation. Right? You know, that great American philosopher Yogi Berra, I think, captured. He said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. And that's what we're dealing with this ratification safeguard. You don't know from day one to day infinity, wherever it takes place decades later, what's going to change. So the ratification safeguard, I suggest to you, is again an illusory argument. So the choice facing state legislatures today, in my opinion, is when the issue is whether to convene a constitutional, a Article 5 convention for proposing amendments, is now James Madison, Rob Nails. James Madison, Rob Nails. I think you have to give serious consideration to James Madison's concerns. I think they're applicable today. I think James Madison had more experience with and knew conventions better than Rob Nadelson, or Mark Meckler, or any of the list of really illustrious conservatives who support this movement. And the risk-benefit analysis has to be done with that sort of thing in mind. I'm afraid, and I'm concerned that it hasn't been done that way. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Right here first, you have.
Back to the 3 delegations that came from instructions.
Right.
Delaware's instructions were very strict. You will not allow the 1 vote per state to go. Delaware's very stubborn holding to that throughout the convention helped to give us the Senate that we had until the 17th Amendment. Equality among the states under the control of the state legislatures.
Okay.
So that one worked.
Okay.
New York didn't work very well.
We put a tick mark on the board to see which ones worked and which didn't.
No.
But I think that's an important piece. That's an important piece.
As to New York's, 2 of its delegates left because they felt like the legislature's rules were being violated. And Alexander Hamilton really didn't have much to do with settling the Constitution as it was. He was too far out. He wanted too much federal power. As I look at the convention, I don't see any of his proposals sticking. He proposed a monarchy that just about blew away.
But the point is, he participated in the process that created a new form of government, contrary to the restrictions placed upon him by the.
Yeah, he did not follow the legislature.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, sir.
Why was the argument favoring the amendment even brought up?
You mean the Article 5?
Yeah, why are we even debating it?
Well, we're debating it today because it is part of the Constitution.
Yes, but who proposed it as a solution for what?
Originally, the first proposal. George Mason was the one who, I was just checking, I thought it was, George Mason is the delegate in Philadelphia who first proposed it. And remember, part of the problem was that the Articles of Confederation had an amendment process to it that required 100% concurrence.
Well, I mean, why
Today,
are we here educating us on something that,
because we have at least, so by one instance, I go to this in the paper, they talk about this morning. I don't think we know how to count to 34. That's a whole different argument. There is a concerted lobbying effort by a number of groups, one of which is called the Convention of States Project. The other is ALEC, American Legislative Executive Council, and some others who are lobbying state legislatures to petition Congress to convene an Article 5 convention.
for what purpose?
To
Use the
their application, the Convention of States application says three purposes. One, to limit federal spending. Two, to limit federal power. And three, to rein in imposed term limits. Those are the three broad topics that are in their application.
Which is BS, they want to get rid of the Constitution, right?
Well, I don't think they can, quote, get rid of the Constitution under Article 5 process, but serious damage could be done. For example, let's assume we pass an amendment that imposes a balanced budget on the federal government. The Constitution now has an amendment that says the budget must be balanced. Well, how do you do that? Well, you tax 90% maybe. And there's all kind of devil in the details kind of things is the problem.
Okay, so what we're fighting is efforts to take away our God-given rights on a number of different fronts. This being one.
That's the potential. That is the potential. And the problem is you don't know until the process is on its way. Whereas under the congressional method, you can read what that proposed amendment is before Congress votes on it. Nancy Pelosi lets you. But
You gotta vote on it first.
so then you can lobby your representatives as to how they should vote. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you've considered a more fundamental problem with Article 5 Convention. Article 5 Convention talks about state legislatures. Article 4, Section 4, says that every state shall be guaranteed a Republican form of government. It's my understanding, and I'm not at the level of constitutional scholarship that you are, that when the Constitution was ratified, there were several states that had monocameral legislatures, just one.
No, Nebraska still does.
Well, actually, they went to two and then they went back to one. There's a progressive.
As of today.
Yeah, now they do. But swiftly, the other states fell in line and interpreted that guarantee of a Republican form of government, that the state constitutions would have the same sort of constitution that the federal government has. So they all adopted bicameral chambers. And like the United States, one chamber was a representative house, which was elected by population clusters, and the other chamber was a true Senate house, whereas in the United States government, we have 2 senators per state, no matter how large the population, no matter how large the land area. And the state governments function the same way, that the state senates were represented by senators that were represented by each county to represent each county. And then Eisenhower, for some reason, maybe you can tell me why, chose Earl Warren to be the head of the Supreme Court.
Eisenhower couldn't tell you why now.
He
It
did
was
say
political.
it was his worst thing he ever did as president. And you would figure they'd vote somebody for a Supreme Court justice whose background was in justice. This guy had been a governor, he'd been a vice presidential candidate, and he had been very frustrated in California by the California Senate, and his quote was, some counties have more cows than people, and we were telling the rest of the county what to do. So as in the Warren Supreme Court, he misinterpreted, in my opinion, the 14th Amendment and the one vote, one person, and said, now all the state legislatures, all 50 of them, their Senate must be elected by population cluster, just like the House of Representatives. So as I see it, we now have in both states, except Nebraska, a House of Commons and a House of Lords. They're completely redundant. They both represent population centers. They both tend to represent the urban clusters where liberal ideas predominate. And the only difference between them is it costs more money to run a state senate campaign than a representative campaign. And that has completely changed the nature of the state legislatures. These are not the same state legislature process
That
now
existed.
that existed when Article 5
That's a good point. That's a good point. I haven't looked at it. You raise a good point. I've gone long. Gayle needs to come up. If there's time at the end, we can pick this up later. Sorry I took so long, Gayle.
I wish you'd been my professor in all my classes in college. The way you speak straight and clear. Thank you.
All right, so you see now why he is such a blessing in our life, to have somebody who has done this, and you've got that paper that's available for you to read, and so much more that we can spend hours on this. And the important thing too is to remember that this has been taped. So this will be on our website. I would say invite people into your home. Have some popcorn and M&Ms. That's a conspiracy. But anyway, and invite people in and watch it with them and discuss it after they're done. What I'm going to talk about today is what's happening right here in the state of Utah. You were asking questions about that. Well, Utah already has 2 calls for an Article 5 convention. Our legislature has voted us into that position, and now they've got even another bill we're going to talk about. But I want to start by talking about what just happened last month with Glenn Beck, because Glenn Beck has been supporting an Article 5 convention for several years now. He's good friends with the people at COS, and there's some good people over there, and those are his friends, and he decided that he would support that. Then, after doing some investigating, reading, and studying, and was exposed to Professor Nadelson, and then Woody's response to that, as he put it, after he prayed about it, he has made the decision to change his mind. So I'm just going to, his statement that he made on his radio show on September 15th, I'm just going to share that statement with you. He said, I have been a supporter of the Article 5 Convention of States. I have been a pretty big supporter, a vocal supporter. I'm reversing that today because after some real thought and prayer, we are not the people to open up this sacred document. We are not the people. That was a God-inspired document that was divinely written. You can read that from, I don't know how many founders, the very hand of God was involved. He said that Benjamin Franklin even said that the very hand of God was involved in writing that document. Glenn goes on to say, do you believe that we could send that kind of delegate today? Someone who when they got to an impasse, someone like Ben Franklin would say, let's pause and go to church and pray. They did not politic, they prayed. I am not for opening up that Constitution anymore because we're not that people anymore. And then the rest of what he said there was, when we are that people, I will be for it again. When we have demonstrated our humility and our obedience to God, and I'm afraid it's going to take a massive beat down of our country to get to that place, then I'll be for it again. Someday we will be humble enough, we will recognize God, but someday we will not be an enemy to God. We will not be so arrogant When we are those people, I will support the Convention of States. But I withdraw my support, and I am sorry to say that. It is because of the fact that this Constitution is wholly inadequate for anyone other than a religious and moral people. We are not those people, and we should not stain this document. Now, that is absolutely beautiful language, and certainly something I agree with, because that's how I've always felt about it. And it has opened up the door to invite all kinds of people to say, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. Because as you've heard over and over, the argument has been so much, well, the founders gave us Article 5, so we're supposed to use it. Well, they gave it to us, and maybe someday we are supposed to use it, but we'll know. We'll know. It's just like when we pray about it. When they send those people, when God sends those people that are those worthy enough to mess with that sacred document, we'll know that. And who knows when that will be. Let's wait for questions. So
This isn't a question. Cleon Skousen also.
that's next. See here? Put it right up there. On September 13, 1994, Cleon Skousen wrote a letter to Phyllis Schlafly, starting with Dearest Phyllis. And then that letter included the following paragraph, and I'll share that. But look at this date. Look at this date. It was September 13th. Glenn said his thing on September 15th. What were they? 28 years apart, but almost to the date. And here's what Cleon said. And I left it back, but I have a copy of the letter with me because he wrote to Phyllis Schlafly. The day that Phyllis Schlafly received that letter, she called me. She was holding the letter in her hand, and she said, you have got, I hope you're sitting down, you've got to hear this letter. And she read the letter to me. This is the paragraph in the letter that was about an Article 5 convention. Cleon said, in all these years, you and I have only divided on one issue, and as time passes, my feeling is that while I was right on the abstract constitutional principle, you were undoubtedly right in sensing a greater danger if we tried to apply Article 5 of the Constitution during a period of the most depraved political corruption in the entire history of our country. In any event, you won, and I am always grateful when the heavenly powers pushes events in a direction which ultimately serves the divine purpose of our great nation's manifest destiny. Now that was 1994, and he was calling that the most depraved time. And isn't that beautiful language, the way he said it? And once again, he was saying, now is not the time. Article 5 is not, it's there for a reason, but now is not the time. I am so grateful that both Cleon and Glenn came to the same conclusions, just 28 years apart. And I've used this letter from Cleon to Phyllis meant a lot to me because I had been talking to Cleon about it many, many times. And so I didn't write that letter to Phyllis. It was just another way of saying now is not the time. But what I want to share with you today, you just received a handout that was passed around to you. And in that handout is this bill on the second page. And this is the bill that was proposed last year at the legislature and that will be proposed again this year, I've been told by the legislators who contacted me about it. We were able last year to defeat that bill, thank goodness, in the committee. It didn't go very far, but they came back from ALEC all excited and ready to go again. And now they're working to get more legislators. And so I'm going to explain quickly what's in this bill, but I want you to look at this chart. This is so unusual to have a bill that has these charts in here, and I'm going to talk about what these charts are about. Because this bill is not the normal, bill that says Utah wants to vote, like we've done twice now, to be part of this call for a convention. No, this is a bill that says we already have enough states to call a convention. Instead, we're going to demand, that's what this letter says, it's right in the bill. We're going to demand that Congress calls the convention now. One state making that demand. Let's see what is in here. I'm just going to, you've got a copy of the bill so that you'll have time to look through it, but I'm just going to explain the bill to you quickly. And this bill says, this joint resolution demands Congress to call an Article 5 convention of states. I've taken these statements directly from the bill. This resolution demands that Congress set a date and a place for an Article 5 convention of states to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government toward achieving a balanced federal budget. it provides that a legal action be undertaken to compel Congress to call an Article 5 Convention of States. If Congress fails to do so within 60 calendar days after receiving this resolution. So what they're saying is, we're going to pass this resolution in one legislative session, and from that time, once this passes, they have 60 days to call that convention or we're going to sue. It's kind of arrogant in the state of Utah to say they have that kind of power, but that's what they're saying.
Congress can order lunch in 60 days.
Well, we're going to sue if they don't. And this bill implores Congress to require that any proposed amendments be ratified by state convention. So now here's the other thing. Remember what Woody said about the fact there's two different ways, and Article 5 explains you can either have a convention or to ratify, or you can, or the legislature can ratify. But this says Utah is going to tell all the states, all 50 states, that you have to ratify by the method of the state convention. So where did this all come from? Well, in the legislation, right here it says, in 1979, the legislature of the state of Nevada passed an Article 5 application for a convention for proposing amendments to the United States Constitution for the purpose of imposing fiscal restraints upon the federal government. So they're saying that, this happened right there when they passed in 1979 that proposal for, a resolution, that gave them enough states. Here's what it says in the bill. The whereas is in this resolution. Whereas, combined with Article 5 applications for a convention of states on any subject, the Nevada Article 5 application was the 34th application constituting 2/3 of all states for a convention of states for imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government toward achieving a balanced federal budget. Whereas Congress has failed to comply with its constitutional mandate to call a convention for proposing amendments on the application of the legislature of 2/3 of the several states upon receipt of the Nevada Article 5 application published in the Congressional Record on February 8th of 1979. Sounds a little confusing there, but what they just said, that made, as that date, in 1979, it made the 34 states that they needed to call the convention. Now, where'd that come from? And this has even added more states to it. Whereas is indicated in the following charts that you have there, the following charts. By the end of 1979, the legislature of 39 states had made application for an Article 5 convention for imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government. Okay, so how'd they get there? They got there by what they call having the plenary, and you'll see that on this chart right here under subject. It tells you what kind of convention, those conventions they're counting. There were several of them, like 29 that they're calling plenary. Supposedly that means, that would mean any, just a general Article 5 convention. But that's not what really happened. Out of those 21, 17 have specifically identified subjects. So they're not just general. Let's look at some of those. Like for instance, Virginia and New York, they're starting, this goes clear back, right here in Utah Bill, it goes clear back to 1788. They're going to gather up all of the calls for a convention since 1788. The ones are called plenary. But the Virginia and New York bill, one in 1788 and 1789, those are for the Bill of Rights. That's not general. But they call Utah is arrogant enough to say it is. And it's already in the Constitution. You heard about that earlier. But they're still going to use it and say we're going to use this to say we've got enough states. And then you have New Jersey in 1861. That's the one on slavery. That's in the Constitution already. We have a constitutional amendment for that. And then we talked about the direct election of senators. And 7 of those states were for the direct election of senators. That's already in the Constitution. We already did that. And again, it's not anyway. And then in Montana, they had, in 1911, they had the anti-polygamy law. We no longer allow polygamy in this country until we have a convention. So how can those calls still be valid? Their subject is already a constitutional amendment. 17 of them. So, and then, I didn't count the ones that have rescinded. What do you think the founders ever intended for us to go back 230 some years and start counting from that, even if they've already passed it and it's already in there. But that's what we're saying in Utah. So you look at that chart I gave you and you'll see how many of those are plenary. 21 of them. And then 18 are for a balanced budget amendment. But they couldn't get past the 18, so they just went back and found all these other states, all these other calls. And that's what they added up. And it says, so, as I said, of the states, some of the states have rescinded. Some have rescinded, like Utah, and then we repassed it. But of the states that rescinded, all previous Article 5 resolutions, including the balanced budget resolutions passed between 1961 and 79, 8 states have rescinded and have never called another convention. We'll go to questions in just a minute. Hang on to your question. We are not anywhere close to having enough states to call a constitutional convention, and yet, what have we done? We're saying we're going to aggregate all of these together, and we demand, and we'll give you 60 days after we demand, and they're going to try to do that again this year. It's embarrassing. So the aggregation strategy of Article 5 convention advocates is a treacherous way to bypass their own failure to achieve consensus in enough states for Congress to call an Article 5 convention. Instead, they create a counterfeit consensus through an aggregation. Think of the amendments that would be proposed when the application for a convention is as broad and vague as this. It's embarrassing, it's upsetting, and yet other states are, and there's other states that are going to try to do this too. There was a few that actually started the process this last legislative session. So also in this, it says, be it further resolved that the legislature of the state of Utah alerts their counterparts in several states of Congress disdain for the constitutional mandate, because of Congress's disdain for the constitutional mandate to call an Article 5 convention upon the application of 2/3 of the states, and admonishes them to take action as will compel the compliance of Congress with the constitutional duty to immediately call a convention of the states. They have disdain for Congress because they didn't figure out that to go back and aggregate all of these calls for all this. I say they have disdain for Article 5, and they have disdain for the Constitution itself. If they will put together something as bogus as this, and take it to the, and legislators are supporting this, and it's growing and growing. Because we're going to be important. You know how important Utah will be that we're the state that demanded that they call this convention? Are they not embarrassed? Are you not embarrassed to think that your legislator would vote for this? So before I go on to this next thing, I just want to explain that you've got this bill, but on the front, I actually at 2 o'clock this morning decided I needed to make this handout for you so that you can take this home and actually read for the things I just talked about, so you understand the bill and what they're trying to do. Now, I want to talk about something that Woody talked about there, because he talked about how the proponents try to dismiss our concerns about a convention by assuring us that anything that comes out of the convention must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. But if we look at the pattern of what's happened so far, that doesn't mean it's going to be 3/4 of the people. And that's what Woody was trying to say. Until they convene that convention and they start making rules, we don't know what those numbers are going to be. But right now, just to get to the convention, our legislature, as I said, we have 2 calls. How did we get those 2 calls that now makes Utah one of the states that would add up to the 38 states they need? It wasn't by 30% of the people in the legislature the legislators. The legislators was just 50% plus 1 of our legislators voted for us to be one of the 2/3 states. So the pattern is set. So I have been to a lot of conventions. I've been to 6 or 7 Republican national conventions. Talk about service. And we're all Republicans. I mean, I look around and think, my gosh, if we threw some Democrats in the middle of this, or we had enough Republicans voting like Democrats that we thought we didn't have, like nothing, the exact same thing. So I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be at a convention when I was supposed to go to the microphone when it was on when the convention had convened on the floor of the convention, and I was proposed to the convention that they vote, that they have a roll call vote on one of the issues. And I said, Mike Lee, Mike, if I go up there, I agreed to do it. The other states had asked us to do. I said, if I go up there though, they're going to turn off my microphone. They're not going to listen to a word I say. I'm some young lady from the state that nobody's ever even heard of our state or me. And you are a sitting senator, United States senator. They would never turn off your microphone. He said, sure, I'm happy to do it. So I was standing next to him. He walks up to that microphone and he stands up to the microphone and he opens his mouth to propose the amendment. And you know what happened? They turned off his microphone. Sitting United States Senator, the chairman of the National Republican Party turned off his microphone like he was more important than the senator, and they never turned it back on. So if you think conventions can be controlled, good luck. Because I watched that mess. I sat through the Rules Committee. Mike was on the Rules Committee. It got so bad, they were ignoring him so badly. They would cheer sometimes when he gave a speech and then vote against him. I got to the point, I'm going to go to the bathroom. I couldn't do that room. I didn't know what was going to happen next. They were making the rules for our convention. So that's what I'm talking about. They're going to make the rules for the convention when they get there. Now, they go by the pattern. And what I have here, if they go by the pattern, which is good chances would be in the rules. And if you look at that, so what they don't tell you is in these 3/4 of the states that it only takes 50% plus one of the delegates to a convention, as we talked about. This is ratifying. We're going to ratify. We'll either be ratifying by convention if Utah gets their way and the sponsor that bill I gave you gets his way, it'll be a convention. That's another story. Or they'll ratify, but the legislature will ratify. Probably it'll be decided in the convention through rule how they're going to do it. So, but when it goes back to be ratified, if they do it like they've done everything else, let's just say it's the legislature, it only takes 50% plus one of the legislators to vote to ratify an amendment. It takes 3/4 of the states, but only 50% of the people. Now, the way the world we live in right now, 50% of the people is not a safeguard. 50% of the legislators is not a safeguard. So the only way around it would be is if through some miracle convention in their rules said, okay, now it goes back to the states, it's going to take 3/4 of the people or 3/4 of the legislature. I don't think those people that are delegates, because more than the way that they're proposing this now is that the delegates to the convention will be legislators. It will be, because they think they can control it. Congress is going to decide who the delegates will be, or at least they're going to say, not who it's going to be, but they're going to, at the very least, say how many delegates. They might let the states decide how they pick their delegates and who the delegates are going to be. But somebody, before they do that, has to say numbers. And so we'll quickly finish this and we'll go back to that. Good questions.
The colors on the map, I'm just wondering.
What?
The colors on the map.
Oh, yeah, don't pay attention to that. That's all I could find. I just wanted to show, I wanted something with colors to show you how many states we have. I mean, that's a lot of votes it would be. So if in fact, as the pattern is, that they just go back and they only need 50%, because I can tell you, right now, those two calls that we have right now to be part of the 2/3 of the states, the 34 states, if they had to have 2/3 of the legislature vote to make us one of the 2/3 states, it wouldn't have passed. That only passed, those calls only passed in the Senate by one vote in the Senate. So it's really hard to get 2/3 of the legislature or 3/4 of the legislature, but it's really easy to get 50%. We see it happen all the time. It's only hard when it's something we want. So I want, again, just pointing out, looking at this, whether it's a convention, and again, it'll be Democrats and Republicans, or whether it's the state legislature, as more than likely it will be the 50% plus one. So let's think about that for just a minute. As Woody pointed out, that in the COS bill, that's the name of the organization, Conventions of States Organization, and we passed their bill, their legislation is one of the resolutions that we passed here in the state of Utah. And as you pointed out, there are three categories, three broad categories, and then under those three categories, you can propose as many amendments as you want that fall within the category. And then two of them I don't have up here, and that's the term limits and the, fiscal side of it, the balanced budget amendment and other things like that. But the category that's called limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Now, what is that interpretation? Like what he said, they had this idea that they've got this, what they call their conservative interpretation of that, and everybody will just vote with them. Well, what would be the liberals' interpretation of limiting the power of the federal government? How about marriage equality? Their greatest fear is that the federal government is going to interfere with marriage equality, which, by the way, isn't just same-sex marriage. That could be polygamy, that could be, underage marriages, whatever. So that could fall into that. So you can see the liberals proposing a marriage equality bill that just says, federal government, you can't interfere. We're gonna have a constitutional amendment that says there's always marriage equality. And how about abortion? Look what happened in Kansas when they thought that they could take it to the people and put it in their constitution that you couldn't have abortion. It lost in Kansas. They couldn't even get 50% of the people to vote for that. And the Equal Rights Amendment, slam dunk for them. I mean, because even like under abortion, they won't call it abortion. They'll talk about a woman's right to choose. And you can see them putting that in the Constitution. And the Equal Rights Amendment, can you think of anybody that you know in the legislature that's going to vote against equal rights for women? Because that's how they interpret it. So as they look at these, and then, the Second Amendment, I don't think they'll get rid of the Second Amendment. I think they would have trouble getting enough votes to get rid of the Second Amendment.
But Hawaii already has. Hawaii proposed a bill to do away with the Second.
I was talking about Utah right now. I'm just kind of using Utah as an example. I don't think they would do that. But what about getting rid of assault weapons? Just amending it. And then, absolutely. Especially after you have a school shooting, everybody's voting for getting rid of assault weapons. Let's do it now. And then what's the definition of an assault weapon? That's how they do it. And so under that category, those are the things they could do. And I can tell you right here in the state of Utah, if we took it to our legislature, or if we appointed delegates to a convention, that any one of these, well, in fact, marriage equality, we just had that in Congress, right? The House already passed a bill that had to do with same-sex marriage and marriage equality and other forms of marriage. And it passed overwhelmingly in the House with a lot of help of Republicans. And do you know what happened? All four, count four, of our congressmen voted for that amendment. Even Burgess, who is so conservative, and I talked to all four of them more than once, and they all had their reasons. They all talked about it, what they claimed they prayed about it, whatever. They all had their reasons. Now, if that can happen, what do you think is going to happen with all of these? And so that's why I'm pointing out, if it is 50% plus one, which, as I said, the pattern is there, and so the delegates to the convention are going to be voting on that. I can't imagine they wouldn't vote themselves that opportunity to have, because they're going to want ratified what they send out, and they're going to want it ratified in the way that it can be allowed, and it's common. It's very common for the legislature or conventions to pass things based on 50% plus one. So one other thing I just want to mention really quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, it's on your handout. But right now in Congress, Congress is trying to do the same thing they're trying to do in the state of Utah. There's HCR right now 101, and that says Congress hereby calls a convention for proposing amendments. That's a federal thing. But here's the thing, here's this HR 8419. And it's it directs the archivist. Now, you all know what the archivists are. You know, that just means, you know, I mean, they are the ones that go into the archives. They're the ones that look up all these things on these charts. And they go into the archives and they go back and they'll see that back in 1788, we had our first proposal for a constitutional convention. And so it's, they're asking, and by the way, the archivist is appointed by the president. We're just about to get a new one back. And so they want the archivists of the United States to count all non-rescinded applications asking Congress to call a convention and to notify Congress of its duty to call a convention when the archivists receive non-rescinded applications for a convention from 2/3, that's the most of the states. And it doesn't permit the archivists to sort the applications by the amendments specific by state legislatures. Instead, it directs the archivists to count all non-rescinded applications together. So think about it. 10 states have rescinded all of their applications for an Article 5 convention, and one state, that's Hawaii, has never passed any application. That means that right now there are 39 states under this formula which have outstanding applications beginning with New York in 1789. That means if these bills pass, Congress will call an Article 5 convention.
Balanced budget.
Just like that. And then I showed you the kinds of things that could be proposed once they call that convention. There's just no way to, and I love the way that Woody pointed out that, you know, because I agree with, it's not a runaway convention. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a planned convention. And they'll come there proposing their amendments, because that's what the convention's about, is that's what he keeps saying. I just love he keeps stressing that. It's an Article 5 convention to propose amendments. And there is no way to limit that. Especially the way they're going to bring all these together. That's the difference. So anyway, please consider that. Please have people into your home to watch this video. Help them understand this. We have got to make sure that our legislature doesn't pass that resolution this year, and they have such momentum. And why? When I talk to people, to the people like this, like talking to you, the people say we don't want the convention. But when you talk to legislators, they say, oh, we want the convention, we need the convention, it's the only way to control anything, we must have a convention. And that's just wrong. They think that they think as legislators, they're going to do a better job. Well, if these legislators are going to do a better job and they do such a good job, why can't we even get legislation passed to parent children in the state of Utah? It's really upsetting. Let's go back here first. In the back row, you still have your question.
Yes, I do. So here you mentioned that, I just want to make sure this is clear. A lot of these ones you say were like for slavery or the Bill of Rights, but it says in the bill that all of these were for fiscal limiting, imposing fiscal restrictions, yes? Are there portions of these applications for constitutional states that were for putting restrictions on federal spending, and those parts did not get passed?
Well, you know, there's no way to know the answer to that with every single one of them, but they call them plenary general, and then with that probably no they're not. We've looked these all up, and you can, that's what, and it's right here. You can look those up and find out for yourself. So the idea that if somehow in there it mentions fiscal, I can't imagine, because they're including the ones for the Bill of Rights. I wouldn't think it would be there, but it's still not plenary because it's not general. It's specific, and that's what we're pointing out is that these are specific. But even at that, let's just think about what, if you really want to be honest about what the founders would be thinking. Do you think they ever thought that we would go all the way back 231 years or whatever it was ago, and say, well, it's that many years since the Bill of Rights was, you know, we've had 17 amendments since then. But would they expect us to go all the way back and just always be counting and always be counting and always be counting? Things have to expire, like was pointed out. Things change, people change, ideas change. And then how could they possibly count things that are already in the Constitution as a reason to call a Constitution? So I think we just look at the honesty of this whole picture and how that should add up and what the founders, expected us to do. So I just can't imagine adding these 21 pulmonary, 17 of them are already in the Constitution. That just doesn't seem right.
There is a serious precedent problem here. Our most recent constitutional amendment was proposed by Congress in 1791 and ratified a few years later and has been allowed to pass with that 200-year
Yeah.
time accumulation.
Okay, we're just about out of time. I want to get a couple more questions.
That's true.
Other than becoming informed ourselves and sharing the information, what else can we do?
Contact your legislators.
Yeah,
I mean, we write our legislators and say,
absolutely,
please.
100%.
Okay,
No,
so-
not 100%. There's a serious problem there. These advocates of Article 5 have been hitting up legislators for decades. This year, they're hitting up Congress, including candidates.
Yeah, right, and that's, you're right, we need to talk to candidates ahead of time to see where they are, and he's right about that, and it's on your paper, the last two things is Congress, and that one you contact our congressman. For the other ones, it's our legislators, they're the ones that are doing this, and we have to tell them we don't want them to do it. One last question.
Where will we find the recording of this machine?
It'll be on our website, I don't
Which
know.
website?
That's UtahEagleForum.org. Has this been live, is this live today? Okay. I'm sure they'll put it on the Facebook page too, the Eagle Forum Political Facebook page. So, thank you.